Wind moves low across the steppe, flattening the grass in long, shifting bands. There are no barriers here, no trees to hold the air in place, no walls to break its path. Everything is exposed, everything moves. A herd gathers on the horizon, stocky bodies, compact and muscular, heads held low. Their coats are the colour of dry earth, fading into the landscape until movement gives them away. The mane stands upright, stiff against the wind. They do not look like the horses most people know. No flowing hair, no elongated limbs shaped for speed across open plains. These animals feel older than that, closer to something foundational, a form that has not been refined, but retained. This is Przewalski's horse, often called the last wild horse, a lineage believed to have never been domesticated. A direct continuation of the horses that once moved across Eurasia before fences, before bridles, before the idea of ownership. But is this really true? Genetic evidence has started to disagree. Perhaps not a purely wild horse, but something more complicated. This forces us to ask a fundamental question. What does wild actually mean? To understand where Przewalski's horse fits, we need to step back and place it within a broader lineage. All modern horses belong to the genus Equus. This is the last surviving branch of a once far more diverse group of equids, animals that varied widely in size, form, and ecology, but are now just reduced to a handful of closely related species. Equus has 7 species alive today, and these fall into a few familiar groups. 3 are asses, the Kiang, onager, and African wild ass. They are built for arid environments, long-limbed, narrow-bodied, with large ears that help dissipate heat. Their coats are typically pale, reflecting sunlight, and their endurance allows them to move across dry landscapes where water is scarce. 3 more are zebras, the plains, mountain, and Grevy's zebras. They carry the most distinctive patterning of any equid. Their bold stripes break up the outline of their body, but they are also more robustly built, adapted to open grassland where visibility is high and predator pressure is constant. And then there are the horses. This may be the most familiar group for many people, but their classification is by far the most complicated. Traditionally, wild and domestic forms have been grouped together under a single species, Equus ferus. Within this, the domestic horse, Equus ferus caballus, is treated not as a separate species, but as a subspecies, one that has been shaped by thousands of years of selective breeding, producing the enormous range of forms we see today. From small, hardy ponies to large draft animals, the variation within domestic horses alone is extreme. But despite this diversity, they are typically considered part of the same species, capable of interbreeding and lacking clear genetic boundaries that would separate them entirely. And the distinction becomes even less clear when we consider feral populations. Across the world, domestic horses have repeatedly returned to the wild, forming free-ranging populations that live and reproduce without direct human control. From a distance, these animals can appear indistinguishable from wild horses, occupying similar environments and displaying similar behaviors. Yet their origins are different. They are not remnants of an unbroken wild lineage, but the descendants of domesticated animals that have, in a sense, reversed course. Alongside them sits Przewalski's horse. Traditionally, this has been treated as a wild counterpart, a second subspecies of Equus ferus, representing a lineage that remained outside of domestication, and perhaps the closest example of what an ancestral horse may have looked like. But even at this level, the picture is not entirely stable. Some classifications elevate Przewalski's horse to a full species in its own right. Others retain it as a subspecies, but question how cleanly it can be separated from domestic forms. The boundaries between species, subspecies, and breed begin to blur, especially in a group so heavily shaped by human influence. Because, unlike most wild animals, horses do not fit neatly into these categories. They have been moved, bred, mixed, and managed across continents for thousands of years. Lineages are split and rejoined. Traits have been selected, lost, and reintroduced. What appears distinct today may not reflect a simple, isolated evolutionary history. So even before we look at genetic evidence, there is already a problem. If Przewalski's horse is the last wild horse, then we should be able to define exactly what separates it from all the others. But that boundary is harder to draw than it first appears. But now let's talk about that genetic evidence. In recent years, advances in ancient DNA have made it possible to compare modern animals directly with populations that lived thousands of years ago, not just in broad terms, but at the level of entire genomes. Among the most important of these comparisons are horses associated with the bowtie culture. These animals lived around 5,500 years ago in what is now northern Kazakhstan. Archaeological evidence suggests that they were among the earliest horses to be managed by humans, kept in large numbers, and likely used for milk and meat. For a long time, they were considered the starting point of horse domestication. So, when their DNA was sequenced, the expectation seemed straightforward. If domestic horses today descended from these early managed populations, then their genetic signatures should match. But they didn't. Modern horses, Equus form a separate lineage. Instead, it was Przewalski's horse that showed the closest relationship. At first glance, this seems to suggest a surprising conclusion, that Przewalski's horse is not the last truly wild horse, but the descendant of an early domesticated population, a lineage that passed through human management and then returned to the wild. But the picture is not quite that simple, because this result can be interpreted more than one way. One possibility is exactly that the horses managed by the bowtie culture were domesticated, and that Przewalski's horse represents their feral descendants. If so, then what we see today is not a lineage that was never domesticated, but one that has been living independently for thousands of years. But there is another possibility, that the bowtie horses were not the ancestors of modern domestic horses at all, but members of a lineage already distinct. A population that may have been managed, even intensively, without giving rise to the domestic horses that would later spread across the world. In this view, Przewalski's horse and the bowtie horses share a common origin, but that does not necessarily make one the descendant of the other in a simple linear way. And even now, there is no complete consensus. The genetic signal is clear. These lineages are closely related, but how that relationship should be interpreted, whether as domestication followed by fertilization, or as a separate parallel lineage, remains an open question. And it raises another possibility. If Przewalski's horse belongs to a lineage distinct from the one that gave rise to modern domestic horses, then perhaps it is not simply a subspecies at all, but something closer to a separate species. But even that boundary is difficult to define. If that is the case, then the distinction we have been relying on begins to break down. We tend to divide animals into clear categories: wild, domestic, feral. But these are not always fixed states. A wild animal exists without human control, and crucially, its lineage has never experienced it. Its behavior is shaped by natural selection, its survival dependent on the environment it inhabits. A domestic animal, by contrast, is shaped by us. Its traits selected, its breeding managed, its survival often tied to human care. And a feral animal sits somewhere in between. It is descended from domesticated ancestors, but lives independently, no longer managed, no longer confined, yet still carrying the legacy of its origins. In horses, this distinction can quickly become unclear, so instead, let's look at cats. Feral populations of the domestic cat are now found across much of the world. They hunt, reproduce, and survive without human care, but their behavior often reflects their origins. Many remain tied to human environments, scavenging around settlements, tolerating a level of disturbance that fully wild animals would usually avoid. Compare this to truly wild species, those that have never been domesticated, such as the flat-headed cat or the Andean mountain cat. These animals are highly specialized and often extremely wary of humans. Their survival strategies are shaped entirely by natural selection, not by a history of domestication. Even when both live without direct human control, the difference remains. But horses present a slightly different problem. Unlike cats, we lack a clear reference point for what a truly wild horse looks like. There are no confirmed wild populations to observe directly. Przewalski's horse has long been treated as that reference. But as we've seen, that assumption is no longer guaranteed. We can try looking to other members of Equus. Zebras, for example, are often more aggressive and far less tolerant of human handling. But whether this reflects their lack of domestication or simply differences between species is difficult to disentangle. Horses may have been domesticated, in part, because they were more tolerant and less aggressive than zebras. We just can't know for sure. Across the world, many populations of horses have made the transition from domestic to feral. Whether we are talking about the Mustangs of the American West, the Guarano of Portugal, or the Brumbies of Australia, they are feral. Released or escaped, they form free-ranging herds that survive without direct human intervention. In behavior and ecology, they can resemble wild animals, occupying similar environments, responding to predators, and structuring themselves into stable social groups. But their origins are recent. Their history is known. Feral Mustangs are in the Americas because they are descended from horses brought by Spanish colonizers in the 15th century. We know that is where they came from. Przewalski's horse offers no such certainty. Its origins are too ancient, too far removed, for us to trace in the same way. If it descends from a population that was once managed by humans, then it too may be feral in origin. But unlike modern feral horses, it has lived independently for thousands of years, long enough to be shaped once again by natural selection. So where does it belong? No one knows for sure. At what point does a feral population become wild again? Is it a matter of time, of genetics, of behavior? And does it even matter? Because the distinction between feral and wild is something we have created, and it may be less meaningful than it first appears. At first glance, the animal itself seems to offer an answer. Przewalski's horse looks different from the horses most of us are familiar with. Its body is compact, its legs relatively short, the head is large, the neck thick. A dark dorsal stripe runs along its back, and the mane stands upright, without the long flowing hair seen in domestic breeds. These traits feel primitive, closer, perhaps, to an ancestral form, the kind of features we might expect from a truly wild horse. If anything, Przewalski's horse looks more like the African wild ass than it does to most horses. Similar proportions, similar mane, but appearances can be misleading. Many of these characteristics are not unique. Similar features appear across a range of domestic horses, particularly in so-called primitive breeds. Dun coloration, upright manes, stocky builds. These are not exclusive to wild populations. They can persist or re-emerge under the right conditions. And feral horses too often begin to change. Over generations living without human management, their bodies shift. Extremes of selective breeding fall away. Proportions become more uniform. Color patterns simplify. What emerges is not a return to the past, but a response to present conditions, shaped once again by natural selection. So when we look at Przewalski's horse, what are we really seeing? Is this the form of a truly wild horse, unchanged, surviving from deep in the past? Or is it the product of thousands of years without human control? A lineage that may have once been managed, but has since adapted to life in the wild. The body cannot tell us, because morphology reflects pressures, not origins. It shows us how an animal lives, but not necessarily where it came from. And in that sense, Przewalski's horse remains as ambiguous as ever. If its origins remain uncertain, its future is not something we can afford to leave to chance. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Przewalski's horse was already in decline. Its range, once spread across the Central Asian steppe, had begun to contract. Expanding human populations brought hunting, competition with livestock, and the gradual loss of habitat. Harsh winters and periods of drought placed additional pressure on already fragmented herds. By the mid-20th century, only a few small groups remained in the wild, confined to remote regions of Mongolia. Then they vanished. The last confirmed sighting in the wild occurred in the 1960s. After that, despite searches, none could be found. The species was declared extinct in the wild. And yet, it did not disappear completely. A small number of individuals had been captured decades earlier and transported to zoos and private collections across Europe. These animals, taken from the wild and held in captivity, became the last representatives of the species. From them, everything that exists today would descend. The founding population was tiny, fewer than 20 individuals, and only a fraction of those contributed genetically to future generations. This created an extreme bottleneck. Diversity was lost. Inbreeding became unavoidable. Every Przewalski's horse alive today carries that history within its DNA. For decades, survival depended entirely on human management. Stud books were established. Breeding was carefully controlled to retain as much genetic diversity as possible. Animals were transferred between institutions. Pairing decisions made not by chance, but by calculation. This was not a wild population. It was a managed one. Its survival shaped, generation by human decisions. And yet, this intervention created an opportunity. By the late 20th century, numbers had increased enough to attempt something that once seemed impossible: a return to the wild. Reintroduction programs began in the 1990s, with horses released into protected areas in Mongolia and China. These animals had been born in captivity. They had no direct experience of life on the open steppe. They had to learn. Some struggled, others adapted. Over time, they began to form stable social groups, establish territories, and reproduce without human assistance. Foals were born into landscapes their ancestors had once roamed. Today, free-ranging populations exist once again. This work is ongoing. Przewalski's horse remains classified as endangered, but its numbers are slowly increasing, offering a measure of hope for their future. In ecological terms, they function as wild animals. They respond to predators, compete for resources, and are shaped by the same environmental pressures that define any wild species. And yet, their story is inseparable from us. Every individual alive today descends from animals that lived under human care. Not domesticated, but not entirely untouched by human influence either. So what does that make them? They are not feral in the usual sense. Any connection to a domesticated lineage, if it exists, lies thousands of years in the past. But neither are they entirely wild in the way we often imagine: untainted, continuous, unbroken. Instead, they occupy a space in between, a population removed from the wild, and then returned to it, shaped first by natural selection, then by human intervention, and now, once again, by the pressures of the environment. So when we ask whether Przewalski's horse is truly wild, the answer becomes even less clear than it was before. Wildness is not something that was simply preserved. It is something that has been rebuilt. We began with a simple question. What is Przewalski's horse? The last wild horse? A feral descendant of animals once managed by humans? Or something in between? For much of modern history, the answer seemed clear. It was wild, untouched, a surviving fragment of a world that had otherwise disappeared. But the more we look, the less certain that answer becomes. Genetics suggests a past more complicated than we once imagined. Behavior offers no clear boundary. Even the body itself, its shape, its color, its form, cannot tell us where it came from. And its survival tells a different story again. A species lost from the wild, preserved in captivity, returned carefully to the landscapes it once inhabited. Not unchanged, but not entirely artificial either. So perhaps the question is not whether it is truly wild. The idea of being wild is not as solid as we might like to believe. It can be lost, it can be altered, and under the right conditions, it can be built again. What matters is not where we choose to draw the line, but that, against the odds, this animal still crosses it. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the Przewalski's horse. If you're interested in the research behind this episode, you can find a document with image credits and sources in the description below. These videos take a great deal of time and research to produce. They will always remain free to watch. But if you would like to support the channel and gain access to new videos a little earlier, you can find a link to my Patreon below as well. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and keep learning. There's still so much to discover. about the world's rare and remarkable species. And the more we understand, the better our chances of protecting them. Thanks for watching.